Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of William Dixon and the murder of Harriet Dixon, which took place in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1876. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information on the backstory of those involved this week, so it will be quite basic. William was born in Newcastle in around 1835 to parents Robert and Elizabeth, and was one of at least 6 children. He had married Harriet Trotter in around 1859, and the couple had at least 4 children together. William worked as a joiner, although he was described by most as a lazy man who was more fond of drinking than working, and it was said that he often argued with his wife and ill-used her, and that they did not have a happy marriage. Harriet, the victim, was born in around 1835 in Alnwick to parents Robert and Mary, and she was one of at least 5 children. Married, as said earlier, to William, she lived with him in Newcastle and was described as being a hard-working woman, not known to drink to excess like her husband on a regular basis, but did enjoy a drink and did sometimes drink too much. On Friday, April the 7th, 1876, Harriet and William were heard arguing at their home in Percy Street in Newcastle. It was quite normal for the couple to argue, so the neighbours did not take much notice. Sounds were heard as if someone was being slapped or struck in some way, then what sounded like someone falling. After this, all was silent. The neighbours simply assumed that the argument was over and that the couple, who had both been drinking that night, had gone to sleep it off. The following morning, at around 8 a.m, a woman by the name of Grace, who lived in a room above the couple, came looking for Harriet and was shocked to find her lying in the outside toilet unconscious. She immediately went to look for William and found him in a street close by. She told him that Harriet was dying, and he replied saying, "Let her die." But he did return to the home, and without much care he took hold of Harriet and dragged her into the house and then went out again. Harriet was put to bed by 2 neighbours, and a policeman and a doctor were sent for. The policeman was told that William often ill-used his wife, and it was felt he had caused her current injuries, so William was quickly arrested and charged with violently assaulting his wife and taken to the police station. The doctor arrived a short time later, and on examining Harriet he felt there was little that could be done to help her, and she died at around 3 p.m. that afternoon without ever regaining consciousness. And after her death, William was charged with her willful murder. The inquest took place at the Stag Inn in Percy Street before Coroner Hoyle. Elizabeth Dixon said she had identified the body as being that of Harriet Dixon, who was her daughter-in-law and married to her son William. Grace Scott said she was a widow living in Percy Street upstairs from the Dixons. She had seen Harriet around 8:30 p.m. on the night of the 7th. She felt she was a little tipsy at the time, but did not think she was drunk. Later, between 10 and 11 p.m, she heard the couple arguing. She heard William tell Harriet to get out of here. She said she heard their door open as if Harriet had gone outside. The door then opened and closed several times, and Grace said she thought that Harriet had gone into the yard and that William kept going out as if to speak to her. She thought she heard the sound of blows being struck, but was not completely sure, and at one point she said she heard Harriet shout, "Murder! Police!" But she did not take any notice of this, as she was used to the couple fighting and thought this was nothing different and just Harriet shouting for no real reason. I must add here that this is not the first story where someone shouted for help, and the neighbours took no notice due to the people involved doing this on a regular basis, and it does remind me of the story of the little boy who cried wolf. Grace continued by saying that the following morning someone who she did not name said something to her about Harriet lying on the ground downstairs, so she went down to look. She said she found her unconscious in the outside toilet, and she then went to look for William and found him at the end of the street. She said she told him that Harriet was dying, and he had replied saying, "Well, just let her die." She said he had also used a bad word when he said "let her die" to describe his wife. However, she said he did come home with her to where Harriet was lying, and that he roughly dragged her inside the house and placed her on the floor. He did not seem too concerned and left the house again, leaving Grace alone. She said she went for the neighbour Jane Vint, and the two lifted Harriet onto the bed and sent for the doctor and the police. Sarah Dodds, Jane Young and Jane Vint all spoke of seeing Harriet lying on the ground in the outside toilet. They all said she did not speak and was insensible when they found her. Jane Vint said she had helped Grace put her to bed, and she had stayed with her, taking care of her as best she could, until she had died at around 3 p.m. on the Saturday afternoon. The other two women said they had left after Harriet was taken into the house. Dr. Page said he had been called to the home of the Dixons in Percy Street. He had found Harriet in bed unconscious. He had examined her and found bruising on her face and arms. He did not feel there was anything he could do to help her, and a neighbour had stayed with her until she had died later that day. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Harriet Dixon. He found many external bruises, some old and some new. He did not see any external wounds to her head, but he had found a large quantity of blood in the brain, and on examining the skull he had found a fracture to the back of the head. He said it was a very recent fracture, and it was his professional opinion that this had been the cause of her death. He was not, however, able to say for sure if this fracture had been caused by a blow or by a fall. P.C. Finlay said he had been called to the house in Percy Street on the morning of April the 8th. Harriet was lying in bed and two women were in the room. There was no sign of her husband, but after he had been told by the women that William had assaulted his wife, he had gone in search of him. He had found him in the area close to his home and arrested him for the assault of his wife. And after her death, the charge had been changed to one of wilful murder. He did not say if William had made any statements on his arrest. Joseph Dixon said he was the son of William and Harriet and lived with them in Percy Street. He was 9 years old. He said on Friday his parents had argued and his father had knocked his mother to the ground. He thought she had fallen backwards and hit her head. She had got up and told his father, "You will not do that again," and his father had told her to get out of the house. He said this was not the first time he had seen his father hit his mother. In fact, he said he did it often, especially when he was drinking. He ended by saying that after his father had knocked his mother to the ground, he had forced her out of the house and she had went outside into the netty. And a netty, for anyone who doesn't know, is a good old Geordie term for a toilet and is a word that is still often used by Geordies today, including myself. There was no evidence to suggest that William had denied attacking his wife, but neither was there any evidence to suggest he had admitted it. It seems in this case William had made no statement at all. The coroner spoke to the jury, explaining to them, as they often did, the difference between murder and manslaughter, saying it was for them to decide if the evidence was leaning more towards manslaughter than murder. The jury retired for only a few moments before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against William Dixon, and he was committed for trial and removed to Newcastle prison. I did not find any details of a funeral for Harriet Dixon. I have noticed in a lot of recent stories that the funerals have not been reported, and as I did say once before, they were often not reported unless there was a very, very big family funeral. However, I do think in this case there would have been a family funeral, as she did have older children who would have hopefully arranged it. But of course I am not able to confirm this. And I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Harriet anywhere in the local area. At this point we would usually move on to the trial, but this again is another story where there would be no trial. Prior to all the trials, the magistrates would review the case, and it would be them who decided if it would proceed or not. And in the case of William Dixon, the magistrates threw out the case and William was discharged. They did not often give details of why the case was thrown out, so we can only assume they felt there was not enough evidence to proceed with the trial. And I was unable to find any confirmed details of William after this date, although I did find one man of a similar age who was also a joiner in 1881 still living in the northeast, and if it was the same William, then it would appear he had remarried, but it's impossible to know for sure if it was the same man. This was again a very strange case. The fact that the neighbours were used to hearing the couple argue and Harriet frequently shouting murder or for the police means that they did not really take any notice on the night before her death. However, it does seem unlikely that if they had gone to see what was wrong, that she would have survived her injuries, but at least she would not have had to have lied outside all night on the floor in the toilet. It seems to me that this was a case where the couple both drank and fought a lot, and as William was a violent man when drinking, and known to abuse his wife, it only seemed like it would be a matter of time before his beatings went too far. I can't understand why the magistrates dismissed the case, even just based on the evidence of old previous bruises, which did suggest he must have had something to do with her death, because I do believe that his actions on that night were directly linked to her death, and at the very least he should have stood trial for manslaughter, and most likely, in my opinion, being found guilty for it too, so I do think he got off very lightly. But perhaps he learned his lesson and he quit the drink after his discharge from prison. But what do you think? Do you think William should have stood trial for the manslaughter of his wife? Or do you think the magistrates were correct and there was perhaps not enough evidence to take it to trial? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange but tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching. It is a somewhat shorter story than usual as there was not a massive amount of evidence, but I do hope that you have still enjoyed it, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.